The twin suns of the Thion system, one a brilliant gold and the other a pale, watchful white, crested the horizon, casting their sterile light over a world defined by order. This was Thion Primus, a jewel of the Imperium, an agri-world perfected. From orbit, it was a marble of breathtaking beauty, swirling with deep greens and vast polished golds, untouched by the vulgar scars of industry or war. There were no sprawling manufactorums belching smoke, no hive cities piercing the stratosphere like jagged wounds. There was only the harvest, eternal and unquestioned. Down on the surface, the scale of this perfection was terrifying. Oceans of genetically perfected wheat, each stalk identical to the last, stretched from one horizon to the next, rippling in a wind that smelled of pollen and industrial fertilizer. These plains were broken only by the shimmering, mirror-like surfaces of the great algae reservoirs, vast inland seas of nutrient-rich protein slurry that glowed a vibrant, unnatural emerald under the suns. The air was clean, scrubbed by massive filtration stacks that hummed a low, omnipresent bass note, a mechanical prayer to the machine god. Above this flat expanse of cultivation, the cities of the nobility glittered. They were not cities in truth, but spires. Impossible needles of white marble and plasteel that soared miles into the thin, clean air, far above the dust of the harvest. Here lived the aristocracy, the high-ranking members of the Adeptus Administratum, and the commanders of the local PDF. They breathed filtered air, drank purified water, and looked down upon their garden world with a sense of profound, unshakable pride. Far below, in the endless fields and processing hubs, lived the true population of Thion Primus, its billions of indentured laborers. Their lives were a testament to imperial order. The day was not measured by the sun, but by the tolling of the great ecclesiarchy bells. The first bell at pre-dawn was the bell of awakening, the second, the bell of labor, the third, the bell of sustenance, where workers were given precisely 15 minutes to consume their nutrient paste before the bell of labor rang again. So it went, a crushing, predictable rhythm of work and prayer, day after day, year after year. They moved in great silent masses, clad in simple gray fatigues, their faces obscured by filtration masks. They were not slaves, the Administratum was quick to point out. They were serfs bound to the God Emperor's holy task of feeding the distant, glorious hive worlds of the subsector. Toil was their prayer, and obedience their salvation. Watching over them was the unwavering gaze of the Imperium. Black carapaced Adeptus Arbites stood motionless on high gantries, their visors reflecting the golden fields. They rarely acted, for their presence alone was enough. Every grain of wheat, every liter of algae was counted. Scribes in high data towers, their fingers stained with ink, maintained the endless ledgers. Thion Primus was not just productive, it was efficient to a fanatical degree. It met its tithes, it exceeded its quotas. It was a perfect functioning cog in the great imperial machine. Governor Varus, ruler of this perfect world, stood on the balcony of his office, located a mile high in the central spire of deliverance. He sipped at a glass of amasec, the vintage impossibly rare, and looked down at his domain. The world was laid out before him like a map. He saw the shimmering lines of the mag trains carrying grain to the orbital ports. He saw the vast, ant-like columns of workers moving to the rhythm of the bells. He smiled. He was hosting a dignitary from the Segmentum Command, a stern-faced admiral who had come to inspect the tithe shipments. "You see, Admiral Varus," said his voice smooth and confident. "Perfection. We have had no blight in 5 centuries, no drought in a millennium. Our populace is 100% compliant and pious. We feed 3 hive worlds. 3. While other governors complain of mutation, of unrest, of heresy." He made a dismissive gesture. "They are weak. they allow the rot of despair to set in. Here, there is only the Emperor's work. Those rumors you mentioned, from the Scourge Star's gutter talk, the fantasies of rogue traitors and madmen. War will not touch Thyon Primus. We are too valuable. We are too pure. The Admiral grunted, unimpressed by the rhetoric, but unable to fault the results. The ships in orbit kilometers-long transports were indeed loading at maximum capacity, but as they spoke, deep within the Administratum data vaults miles below, a low-level Lex mechanic was frowning at his flickering green screen. An anomaly, a minor one barely worth noting, but it troubled his meticulously ordered mind. A cargo freighter, the Stellar Pilgrim, had just filed its departure clearance. Its transponder code was valid. Its cargo manifest was logged processed agricultural machinery for export. But its last port of call, buried deep in the encoded routing data, was a quarantine marker near the Calyx expanse, worryingly close to the rumored edge of the Scourge Stars. The ship had docked at Thion's smallest, least automated orbital station, loaded its machinery, and was now leaving. All within regulations. But the Lex mechanic felt a cold sensation, a subtle dissonance in the perfect order of his world. He checked the quarantine flag. It had been overridden. The authorization code was high, impossibly high, originating from a source his clearance level could not even query. He shivered then. With the practiced obedience of his station, he stamped the file "Approved" and sent the Stellar Pilgrim on its way. Its dark hold filled with a special cargo that was not machinery at all. The omen had passed unnoticed by all but one, and he had already dismissed it as a fleeting error in the perfect divine machine. Weeks passed. The flawless rhythm of Thyon Primus continued. The suns rose, the bells told the grain was harvested. Then a new star appeared in the sky, a pinprick of light moving against the static constellations. It was the Harbinger of Bounty, a bulk freighter, registered to a minor Chartist house returning from its subsector route. It was 3 weeks behind schedule, a fact that caused a brief flurry of reprogramming in the orbital traffic control spires. The ship was vast, ugly, and utilitarian, its hull stained with the grime of void travel. But as it maneuvered into a high anchor orbit, the long-range pict capturers in the customs station registered something more. The hull plating seemed softened. Patches of rust were not the usual reddish-brown, but a vibrant, wet-looking ochre. Small, pox-like blisters marred the adamantium skin of the vessel, as if it were suffering from some metallurgical disease. At Orbital Station Tertius, Chief Customs Proctor Rel glanced at his console. Bioscan anomaly on the Harbinger. He said, his voice bored. He had been on shift for 18 hours, fueled by stale recaf. He opened a Vox channel. Station Tertius to Harbinger of Bounty. Your life support readings are irregular. We're showing multiple unregistered biosignatures and a high-level atmospheric spore count. Power down your engines and prepare for a full quarantine inspection. The reply crackled thick with static, but beneath it was another sound, a wet, gurgling quality. Apologies, Proctor, the voice boomed, unnervingly cheerful. Our scrubbers have been generous this trip. A minor malfunction. We carry a bonus, a gift for the good governor. A tithe offering from a newly compliant world. It would be a shame if it spoiled due to imperial red tape. There was a pause, followed by a sound like a wet chuckle. Check routing authorization 777. A gift for the hard-working men of Thyon. Rel sighed. He was a cog, and he knew it. He tapped in the code. A high-priority Administratum-level override appeared, signed with a cipher he didn't recognize, but was programmed to obey. The override flashed green. Expedite. Below it, a private ledger note appeared, a significant bonus credited to Rel's personal resource account. He looked at the flashing red quarantine warning, then at the green override and the ledger credit. He silenced the bio-alarm. "Understood, Harbinger. Proceed to Docking Bay 94 Delta." Welcome home. The ship descended, bypassing the clean, automated cargo ports of the spires. It settled into 94 Delta, a sprawling, filthy junction of warehouses and processing plants that serviced the lower city and the spaceport slums. The great cargo bay doors groaned open, releasing a cloud of greenish mist that smelled sickeningly sweet, like rotting fruit and honey. The dock gangs waiting under the harsh floodlights moved forward. They were massive, vat-grown men and women, clad in stained canvas overalls, their faces dull. The ship's crew emerged to supervise the unloading. They were few, and they moved with a strange, lumbering gait. They were swathed in heavy, dripping robes, and their faces were hidden by filtration masks. But the masks couldn't hide the buzzing. A swarm of flies, fat and black as corpse eaters, moved with them, a living aura of filth. The dock workers recoiled, but the robed crewmen only laughed, their voices muffled and wet. They are blessings. They sing the song of the grandfather's generosity. The first crate was lowered. It was stamped with the same 777 sigil. It was leaking. A thick, viscous fluid the color of dark honey oozed from a poorly sealed seam, bubbling softly as it hit the gritty deck. It pooled around the boot of a dock worker named Garl. He grunted, kicking at the crate. "Watch the seals, you void-damned filth." One of the robed figures shambled closer. "Do not be angry, brother," it gurgled, reaching out a gloved hand. The glove was rotten, weeping the same fluid. "It is a gift. You are the first to be blessed. You are the chosen." Before Garl could react, the crewman wiped his leaking glove across Garl's chest, leaving a glistening smear on his overalls. Garl shoved him back, raising a fist. "Get your rot off me." The robed figure simply stood there, head tilted, as if listening to a private joke. "It is already on you, brother. It is already in you." "Welcome." He laughed again, a sound like honey bubbling in a diseased lung. The flies descended, settling on the glistening patch on Garl's chest. He swatted at them, cursed, and turned back to his work, the foreman's whistle shrieking for the next crate. The liquid had already soaked through the canvas, touching his skin. It didn't burn. It felt warm. Garl finished his shift. The bell of rest. A deep, resonant clang echoed across the sprawling port district, signaling the end of the second cycle shift. He walked away from the docking bay, moving stiffly. The warmth on his chest, where the robed man had touched him, had spread. It was a pleasant, tingling heat, like strong amasec sluicing through his veins. The chronic ache in his lower back, a companion for 20 years of hard labor, was gone. The world seemed softer. The harsh sodium-orange floodlights of the port felt warm, not accusatory. He found himself humming a tuneless, bubbling melody. He lived as all dock workers did in the shadow of the great spaceport. Hab Block 94 Delta was a mountain range of rust, a city built from discarded shipping containers and scavenged plasteel piled precariously high. It was a place of dripping pipes, narrow, lightless corridors, and the constant smell of unrecycled human waste and fungal broth. It was a place of misery, of short, brutal lives, of constant grating noise, shouting, coughing, weeping. Tonight, Garl did not notice the filth. He felt a profound sense of relief, an unwinding of a tension he hadn't known he was carrying. He entered his cramped habitation pod shared with his wife, Alara, her sister, and their combined 3 children. One of the children, little Milo, was coughing the dry, hacking shant lung that claimed half the infants in 94 Delta. "You're late," Alara whispered, her face etched with the usual lines of exhaustion and fear. "Did you get the extra rations?" Garl looked at her. He smiled. It was a wide, genuine smile, and the sight of it terrified her more than his usual sullen anger. "Rations?" He said, his voice thick as if his throat was coated in honey. "No, sister. I brought something better. A gift." He reached out and stroked her cheek. His hand was hot and damp. "No more worrying, Alara. It's all fine. It's all gonna be fine." He sat on their thin sleeping mat. He didn't eat. He just sat humming as the warmth inside him grew. A single fat black fly, which had followed him from the Harbinger, buzzed in lazy circles under the single flickering light globe. It landed on the coughing child's lips. The child Milo did not swat it away. His coughing stopped. He giggled a small, wet sound. Within 3 days, 994 Delta had changed. The cacophony of misery had been replaced by a new sound laughter. It was a strange, bubbling, unstoppable mirth that echoed from the rust-streaked corridors. They called it the honey sickness. It started with the warmth, the relief. Then came the swelling. Skin blistered not with the angry red of infection, but with a pale, doughy distension. Pustules the size of a man's fist grew glistening with a golden honey-like fluid that smelled sickeningly sweet. When they burst, there was no pain, only another wave of ecstatic relief. Those infected no longer slept. They no longer fought over scraps of food. They gathered. They shared, holding out weeping, swollen hands to their neighbors. They became generous. They also became fixated. The number 7 was suddenly, inexplicably holy. They would stop mid-giggle to count the rivets on a bulkhead. 7, they would whisper, and be overcome with joy. They scratched the numeral into the grime on the walls with fingers that were beginning to fuse together. Chirurgeon Malachi, a junior medici officer assigned to the 94 Delta Slum Clinic, slammed the door of his sanitized prep room. He had not had a single patient in 2 days. This was not a blessing. It was an impossibility. The slum dwellers were perpetually sick. He pulled on his heavy rebreather, sealed his hazard suit, and stepped outside. The air in the corridor was thick, hazy, and sweet. The buzzing of flies was deafening. He found his first patients clustered in a small plaza. They were dancing. A slow, shuffling, joyous dance, their swollen bodies leaking golden fluid onto the floor. He saw Garl, now a monstrous figure, his features almost erased by the pale, doughy swelling. Garl was ladling a foul-looking broth from a communal pot, handing it to others. "Garl by the Emperor's teeth, man." "What is this?" Malachi yelled, his voice tinny over the rebreather's speaker. Garl turned his eyes milky and joyous. "Doctor." "You've come, isn't it a blessing, no pain?" "Doctor." "The hunger is gone. The cold is gone. The grandfather has given us a gift." He held up his hand. It was a swollen, webbed mass, but he had tied a scrap of cloth around his thumb to create 2 new fingers, allowing him to count to 7. Malachi raised his medical scanner. The readings were nonsensical. The subjects were registering massive system-wide infection tissue necrosis and cellular mutation on an unprecedented scale. Yet their vital signs were strong. Their dopamine levels were lethally high. They were, according to his scanner, in perfect health and dying all at once. This was not a disease. This was a perversion of biology itself. He ran. He sealed himself back inside his clinic, his heart hammering against his ribs. He bypassed the local channels, sending a Priority 7 astropathic data burst straight to the high spires to the Adepta Sanitatis. He described the symptoms, the euphoric state, the golden fluid, the cellular breakdown, the numerical fixation. He titled the report, Potential Xenos Pathogen Outbreak. Note, Probable Psychoheresy. Recommend immediate level Omega quarantine of 94 Delta. The message arrived. It was routed from the astropathic choir to the Administratum's central processing scriptorium. A bored scribe, his job to sort 10,000 reports a day, glanced at the origin, Slum Clinic 94 Delta. He saw the keywords Epidemic, hysteria, local quarantine. He sighed. The proles were always dying of something new and dramatic. He filed it under Planetary Health Endemic Non-Critical and moved on to the next report, a missing shipment of agricultural fertilizer. Malachi's warning the first and last true chance Thion Primus had was lost. Buried beneath a mountain of paperwork, the perfect sterile bureaucracy of the Imperium had just doomed the world. The honey sickness was no longer just a physical ailment. It had become a shared consciousness. The infected huddled together in the warm, damp corridors of 94 Delta began to dream the same dream. It was not the nightmare of fever, but a vision of profound, unsettling peace. They dreamt of a garden, not a manicured imperial garden of stark, rigid topiaries, but a place of impossible, riotous life. Great trees, with bark like weeping flesh, drooped heavy with pale, swollen fruit. Fungi of every color, glowing with a soft, phosphorescent light, carpeted the ground. A lazy, winding river of thick, milky fluid meandered through the landscape. The air was thick, not with the stench of decay, but with the rich, loamy aroma of 1,000 blooms and the buzzing of innumerable iridescent insects. In the heart of this garden stood a house, a vast, crumbling manse that seemed to be joyfully collapsing into the earth, its timbers rotten and soft, its walls covered in loving moss. And on the porch, in a vast, creaking, rocking chair, sat a figure. He was colossal, a mountain of joyous flesh, his form barely discernible, his features lost in shadow and benevolent growths. He did not speak, but he emanated a feeling, a deep, uncritical, overwhelming love. He saw their pain, their toil, their fear, and he found it all wonderful. He was vaster than any cathedral, more present than the distant, cold emperor. As one, the dreaming sick of 94 Delta gave him a name. They called him Grandfather. When they woke, the joy of their sickness was redoubled, a pale reflection of the ecstasy of the dream. They were no longer just sick. They were the chosen. Garl was the first to fully understand. His physical transformation was advancing at a terrifying rate. He was no longer recognizable as human. His body was a single bloated mass of pale flesh, his limbs like swollen sausages, his face a simple mask with 3 weeping holes for eyes and a perpetually grinning, bubbling mouth. He no longer walked. He shuffled his passage, leaving a glistening trail of golden mucus. He dragged himself to the center of the slum's main plaza, the same place chirurgeon Malachi had fled. He climbed atop a pile of discarded, rusting machinery, and he began to speak. His voice was no longer Garl's voice. It was a chorus, a wet, resonant sound that seemed to come from his entire body, amplified by the buzzing of the flies that now formed a permanent, swirling halo around his head. Brothers, sisters, children of the generous gift. He boomed, and the shuffling, giggling masses fell silent, their milky eyes turning to him. For all our lives we have been told, we are nothing. Garl, or the thing that was Garl, proclaimed. We are the dregs, the filth, the shadows beneath the spires. We toil in the cold, we ache in the dark, and we are told to be grateful for the judgment of a distant golden corpse. He spat a thick, honey-like glob. They lie. The pain is a lie. The fear is a lie. He spread his fused arms wide. But the grandfather, he loves the filth. He loves the ache. He loves the parts of us that weep and rot and are afraid he sees our suffering, and he does not judge it. He ends it. He gives us this. He slapped his own swollen belly, which wobbled, and a fresh wave of joyous laughter reconned through the crowd. He takes away the pain. He takes away the hunger. He asks only that we accept. Accept the change. Accept the blessing. Accept the new true life he offers. He called himself the Pontiff of Rebirth. He was the first priest of Nurgle on Thion Primus. The crowd surged forward, their voices rising in a wet, ecstatic chant. "Grandfather, grandfather loves us." A woman, her hair fallen out in clumps, her skin covered in weeping sores, crawled to his feet. "How Pontiff, how do we accept more?" Garl's grin widened. He picked up a jagged shard of plasteel from the junk pile, its edge coated in rust and older, darker stains. "They told us to fear the wound," he sang. "They told us to fear the sickness. But the wound is the door. The sickness is the key." With a grunt of pure ecstasy, he dragged the sharp edge across his own arm. There was no blood, only a gush of the same golden, sweet-smelling fluid which steamed in the damp air. Garl sighed, his eyes rolling back. "It is a new making, it is a joy." A frenzy began. The cultists, desperate for this final release, seized upon the idea. They found shards of metal, broken glass, splintered wood. They began to bless themselves and each other, cutting into their swollen flesh, not with the despair of suicide, but with the fervor of zealots. They smeared the leaking fluids, the grime of the slum floor, and their own waste into the fresh wounds, eager to welcome the gift, more deeply to accelerate their transformation, to become more worthy of the grandfather's love. The last vestiges of Imperial sanity in 94 Delta dissolved, replaced by a joyous, self-mutilating congregation, celebrating their own beautiful decomposition. The sterile tranquility of the spire of deliverance was finally shattered. Not by an alarm or an explosion, but by the unseemly, panicked arrival of High Proctor Rel, the same customs officer who had cleared the harbinger of bounty. He had run an act of profound indecency in the spire up the final flight of marble stairs to Governor Varys's personal office, his pristine black uniform stained with sweat. He bypassed the governor's secretaries, bursting into the opulent chamber. Varys looked up from a data slate detailing grain export figures, his face a mask of cold fury at the intrusion. "Proctor, your conduct is—" "They won't answer," Governor Rel blurted, his voice cracking. "Hab Block 94 Delta, the entire district. It's gone dark. No data feed. No work gangs logging out. And the Arbites precinct inside, they've sealed their own doors. They're screaming. They're screaming about monsters." He finally produced Chirurgeon Malachai's report, physically retrieved from the data sump by a terrified menial. "This came in 3 days ago, my lord. It was misfiled." Varys read the report. His expression shifted from anger to pure aristocratic disgust. Psychoheresy, mass hysteria, uncontrolled biological mutation. These were words for other lesser worlds. They were filth, and they had dared to stain his perfect record. He slammed his fist on his desk, not in fear, but in rage. Filth. The proles have let some gutter sickness fester into a spiritual contagion. This is what happens when you spare the rod. Proctor, you are demoted. Now contact the Lord Marshal of the Arbites. Tell him I want 94 Delta purged, cleansed. I want every last infected deviant executed and incinerated. I want order restored by the time the bells ring for the morning shift. His command was absolute and immediate. Within the hour, 5 full precincts of Adeptus Arbites were mobilized. They were not a subtle force. They marched in perfect, intimidating rows, their black carapace armor polished to a mirror shine, their shock mauls humming with latent power, and their combat shotguns loaded with execution shells. They were the fist of Imperial law, descending to crush a minor, disgusting insurrection. They set up a hard perimeter, their armored transports blocking every rusted alleyway, and then as one, they advanced, rebreathers, sealed visors down. The slums were silent. The usual sounds of misery were gone. The only sound was the omnipresent, deafening buzz of flies and a faint, wet, melodic humming. They turned the first corner into the main plaza and stopped. The cult was there waiting, hundreds of them. They were gathered as if for a festival, their swollen, leaking bodies shuffling in a slow, joyous dance. The Pontiff of Rebirth, Garl, stood on his junk pile throne, his arms spread wide in welcome. Fire commanded the Arbite's marshal. The first volley was disciplined. Solid slug shells and lasgun beams tore into the front rank of the infected. The effect was not what they expected. The cultists did not scream in pain or fear. They cheered. As the projectiles hit them, their pale, swollen bodies burst like overripe fruit, sending spectacular jets of golden, steaming fluid and thick, clotted gore arcing over the Arbite's ranks. The cultists who were hit looked down at their own horrific wounds with expressions of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. "It's the blessing," one screamed as a lasbolt cauterized his chest. "He sees us. The Grandfather loves us." They advanced not to fight, but to share. They ran forward, arms, opened their faces, split in hideous grins, trying to embrace the men in black armor. They saw the Arbites not as executioners, but as new converts, souls to be saved and welcomed into the fold. "Join us, brothers," they gurgled, laughing as shock mauls crushed their soft skulls, their last act to smear their infectious blood on their killers. The Arbite's discipline broke. This was not a riot. It was a form of psychological warfare they were utterly unprepared for. The sheer joy of their enemy was more terrifying than any hatred. They fired wildly their heavy boots, slipping in the ankle-deep sludge of gore pus and honey-like mucus. With every shot, they released another cloud of virulent aerosolized pathogens. Back to the perimeter, the marshal roared, his voice laced with the first hint of panic. He looked down at his own breastplate. It was slick with the golden fluid. A fat black fly was crawling on his visor, just inches from his eye. He smashed it, but another took its place. And another. He felt a sudden inappropriate warmth in his gut. A tickle in his throat that wasn't a cough, but the beginning of a giggle. The Arbites routed. They fled, trampling each other to get back to their transports, sealing the heavy doors behind them. They had killed hundreds, but thousands more were still shuffling, singing, and dancing in the plaza. The purge had failed catastrophically. As the armored transport sped back to the safety of the Spire bastions, the men inside sat in stunned, contaminated silence. One of them, a young officer, began to tap his finger on his knee. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He paused, looked at his hand, as if it were a newfound treasure, and began very softly to laugh. The plague was no longer contained, 94 Delta. The Arbites, Varys's iron fist, had become its unwilling messengers, carrying the Grandfather's gift back to the clean, orderly heart of their own bastions. The failure of the Arbites was not merely a tactical retreat. It was a signal. It was the moment the infection, having secured its beachhead in the populace, turned its attention to the planet itself. The change began not with a bang, but with a sickening, pervasive smell. It rolled in from the port districts, a sweet, cloying aroma of overripe fruit honey and damp earth. Within a day, it had smothered the entire world, clinging to the sterile marble of the spires and seeping into the filtered air systems. Then came the fields, the endless, perfect golden oceans of wheat that were the pride of Thyon Primus died. They did not wither from drought or burn from fire. They liquefied. The strong, genetically pure stalks, which stood as high as a man's chest, simply lost their integrity. They sagged, booed, and then collapsed into a single contiguous mass of foul-smelling brown sludge. The wind, which once whispered through the grain, now made a wet, slurping sound as it passed over the miles of viscous mush. But this was Nurgle's gift, and death was only a beginning. From the sludge, new life erupted. Pale, fleshy fungi shaped like grasping hands, and weeping eyes pushed skyward. The wheat stalks themselves rotting in the mire sprouted bulbous, pus-filled nodules that burst when the wind blew, releasing clouds of rust-colored spores. The harvest was no longer of grain, but of pestilence. The great algae reservoirs, the planet's emerald protein source, fared no better. The vibrant green, so clean it was almost sterile, turned a churning, opaque brown. The vast vats began to bubble, not with the clean oxygen of photosynthesis, but with thick, slow bursts of methane and hydrogen sulfide that stank of 1 billion rotten eggs. The meticulously maintained filtration systems choked and dyed their machinery, fouling with a thick, fibrous slime. Then things began to surface. The bioengineered algae, designed to be microscopic, had mutated. Vast, continent-sized mats of leathery, diseased kelp rose to the surface, and tangled within them were the planet's native marine life, now swollen to obscene sizes. Leviathans, which had lived unseen in the depths, floated to the surface, their bodies distended with corpse gas, their eyes milky and joyous, their flesh host to 1 billion new forms of parasitic life. The reservoirs had become a planetary soup of decay. High in the spires, the nobility watched in horror through their macro binoculars. Their world, their perfect, clean, orderly garden, was becoming a swamp. They sealed the great blast doors at the base of their cities, believing they could wait it out, that the filth of the lower world could not touch them in their sterile towers. They were wrong. The sky, which for centuries had been a flawless, pale blue, began to change. It sickened, turning a bruised greenish yellow, as if the very atmosphere was jaundiced. The spore clouds rising from the plains of rotting wheat were so vast they choked the upper atmosphere, blotting out the twin suns. And then it rained. It was not the clean, recycled water of the irrigation systems. The first drops were thick, greasy, and warm. They left oily, rainbow-colored smears on the marble balconies of the spires. It was a vile, yellowish-green mucus, a nourishing fluid that carried the blessings of the warp directly from the sky. Where it fell, the decay accelerated. Plasteel began to corrode, not with simple rust, but with a creeping, organic blight that left it soft and spongy. Stone wept. The very earth, saturated with this divine pestilence, sighed and released new, teeming bacterial life that had never before existed in the material universe. The world of Thion Primus was no longer dying. It was being digested. Within the spire of deliverance, the great adamantium storm doors were sealed. The air recyclers were pushed to their maximum, their ozone-scrubbed output a tangible hiss in the opulent halls. Governor Varys had declared a state of absolute quarantine. Outside, his world was liquefying, but inside, the illusion of imperial order would be maintained. This illusion took the form of a grotesque, frantic denial. The grand ballroom of the spire, a chamber vast enough to hold a regiment, was alight. Its crystal chandeliers, each the size of a ground car, blazed with light, attempting to banish the sickly green twilight that pressed in through the high armored glass windows. An orchestra played the music, frantic and shrill, barely audible over the forced, high-pitched laughter of the attendees. This was the last party. The aristocracy of Thion Primus, trapped in their ivory tower, had gathered in their finest silks and dress uniforms. They drank priceless amasec and gorged themselves on synth meats and exotic fruits, their movements jerky and desperate. They were trying to celebrate their own purity, their separation from the filth below. But the grandfather is generous, and his gifts are for all. The plague had entered the spire long before the doors were sealed. It had come in on the polished boots of the rooted Arbites. It had seeped in through microscopic cracks in the seals. And most insidiously, it was now being lovingly distributed by the spire's own life support systems. The massive air filters choked with the new virulent spores from the sky had become culture vats. They were no longer scrubbing the air. They were infusing it, pumping a fine, sweet-smelling mist of contagion into every room. It began subtly. Lady Olesia, known for her sharp wit, laughed at a dull joke, and her laughter dissolved into a wet, bubbling cough. She pressed a silk handkerchief to her lips, and when she pulled it away, she saw not blood, but a smear of golden honey-like fluid. She stared at it, her eyes wide, and then she giggled, a genuine, irrepressible, joyous giggle. Across the room, Lord Militant Crassus, his uniform straining against his thickening gut, suddenly sighed in contentment, a profound warmth spreading through his limbs, easing the ache of his old campaign wounds. The facade of denial did not last the night. The nobility of Thion Primus was not like the oppressed laborers. They were creatures of vice, of jaded appetites, and profound, soul-deep boredom. They had seen everything done everything, and found meaning in nothing. When the sickness came, it did not find minds rigid with imperial piety. It found minds that were soft, decadent, and desperate for a new sensation. A small circle of younger nobles led by the aesthete Baronet Felm had already been experimenting with esoteric cults. When the swellings began, they did not see it as a disease. They saw it as a transformation, a new form of bodily art. They retreated from the main party gathering in a private silk-draped salon. They called it the Hortulin Court. They watched in rapture as their skin blistered, admiring the pearls of pus that formed. They did not scratch or hide them. They adorned them, painting them with priceless pigments, arranging their weeping sores in aesthetically pleasing patterns. They competed to see who could cultivate the most exquisite mutation. They stopped eating the synth food and began to dine on the strange fleshy fungi that had begun to sprout from the expensive loam-soaked carpets. The ballroom, once a symbol of order, became their garden of flesh, a humid hothouse of aristocratic depravity and joyous, willful corruption. Governor Varys was not at the party. He was alone in his penthouse, a fortress within the fortress, his private medici servitors scanning him hourly for any sign of infection. He sat in the dark, staring at the green rain-lashed windows, listening to the faint mad music from the ballroom below. He was the last bastion of sanity, he told himself. He was the governor. He was pure. The door to his study chimed. "Enter," he barked, expecting his chief of staff. The door hissed open, and his son, Lycanus, entered. Lycanus, his arrogant, handsome heir, the symbol of his legacy. But this was not Lycanus. The young man's fine uniform was torn open, revealing a chest and abdomen that were no longer human. His flesh was a pale, doughy mass, weeping golden fluid, his belly swollen as if grotesquely pregnant. His face was serene, beatific, the familiar aristocratic arrogance, replaced by a look of utter, loving peace. A halo of fat black flies buzzed around his head. Lycanus Varys whispered, his hand trembling as he reached for the last pistol on his desk. "Father," the thing gurgled, its voice a wet chorus. "You look so strained, so full of pain. You've been carrying this burden for so long." It shuffled forward, leaving a glistening trail on the priceless rug. "But it's over now. The work is done. You don't have to be afraid of failure anymore. The grandfather loves your failure. He loves you." "Get back!" Varys screamed, raising the pistol. "You are unclean. We are all unclean, father," Lycanus said, his smile widening. He did not stop. He was stronger now, his bloated form possessing a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. He walked directly into the raised pistol. "And it is a blessing." He pushed the weapon aside as if it were a toy, and wrapped his weeping, swollen arms around his father in a suffocating embrace. Varus fired the last shot harmlessly, burying itself in the diseased bulk of his son. He felt the bursting of pustules against his chest, a deluge of warm septic fluid drenching his uniform, splashing onto his face, into his open, screaming mouth. The taste was impossibly, sickeningly sweet. His scream of terror caught in his throat. It fractured. It became a cough, then a gasp, then a low, bubbling chuckle that he could not for the life of him stop. Governor Varus, ruler of the garden world, had received his son's gift. He slid to the floor, wrapped in the loving, pestilential embrace, his sanity dissolving in a final ecstatic wave of pure, unadulterated relief. Not all on Thion Primus had fallen to the joyous bliss of corruption. There were pockets of resistance, small, defiant islands of imperial faith in a surging ocean of filth. The most important of these was the Tower of Voices, the sanctum of the Adeptus Astropathica. It was a needle of black psychoconductive basalt, deliberately isolated from the spire cities, its integrity protected by void shields and consecrated wards. Within its walls, a desperate remnant held out 12 inquisitorial stormtroopers of the Ordo Hereticus, their crimson and black armor a stark contrast to the sterile white robes of the 24 astropaths they were protecting. Leading them was Interrogator Xtella, a grim-faced woman whose authority was absolute. She stood at the final blast door, her hot-shot lace gun held at the ready. Outside, the noise was not of battle, but of celebration. A wet, rhythmic chanting and the thud of thousands of shuffling feet. "Seals are holding," she said. Her voice clipped and metallic over the vox, but they are not trying to break in. They are waiting. Cateless, send the message. Send it now. At the center of the choir chamber, Astropath Prime. Kylus stood on a raised dais, his blind, scarred eyes turned upwards, as if he could see the sky. He and his choir were linked their minds, a single, desperate beacon. "We are trying, Interrogator," he whispered, his voice thin, his hands clenched. "The warp. It is not empty. It is not the storm of real space. It is thick, viscous, like screaming into a swamp. Try harder," Xtella ordered, as a heavy, wet splat hit the door, followed by a sizzling sound. One of her troopers checked a gauge. "Acid. They're dissolving the seals. Purity of shell is compromised. Now Kalis for the throne." Kalis cried out a psychic shriek that was echoed by his choir. They poured all their will, all their faith, all their terror into a single focused cry for help. A beam of pure data aimed at the distant stars. Thion Primus, Governor Varus fallen, planetary population compromised. Massive bioheresy. Xenos or demonic influence confirmed. We request exterminatus. By the Emperor's will, cleanse this world. The message shot into the Imperium, but the swamp was waiting. The presence of Nurgle, which had so lovingly saturated the planet, had also saturated its psychic shadow. The message did not travel cleanly. As it screamed through the warp, it was caught twisted and changed. The desperate plea for exterminatus was wrapped in a gurgling chuckle. The coordinates for Thion Primus were lovingly smeared, the numbers 777 etched over them. The coded report on bioheresy was corrupted, its meaning inverted from a warning into an invitation. Far away, monitoring stations in the Segmentum Solar would receive this message, but they would not hear a cry for help. They would hear only a garbled stream of noise, static, and a single recurring, joyous, bubbling laugh. In the choir chamber, the backlash was horrific. One of the younger astropaths shrieked, clawing at his robes. "It's a garden, I see it. It's not a storm, it's a beautiful, endless garden." He began to laugh, tears of golden fluid streaming from his blind eyes. A stormtrooper sergeant, his face grim, ended his revelation with a single clean last shot. Kahless collapsed, clutching his head. "It's sent," he gasped, but it was welcomed. "Oh, Emperor in Terra, what have we done?" "It doesn't matter," Stella said, as the great blast door, its adamantium hide now soft and porous as rotten wood, finally sagged, groaned, and split open. "They're here." For the Emperor, the things that shambled in were no longer the simple, swollen cultists of the slums. They were the first true poxwalkers. Their bodies were broken, and reformed bones jutting through skin, their flesh a canvas of weeping sores, and joyous mutations their bellies, distended with new, unholy life. They were animated by a singular happy will, and they did not fear death. The stormtroopers opened fire, their hellguns punching clean holes through the advancing mass. But for every poxwalker that exploded in a cloud of filth, 3 more shuffled forward, their arms open wide, their gurgling moans a hymn of welcome. The stormtroopers fought with disciplined fury, but their armor splashed with corrosive bile began to hiss and corrode. They were pulled down one by one, their defiant screams dissolving into the gurgles of the horde, as they were embraced and gifted. Stella, her ammunition spent, detonated the crack grenades on her belt, granting herself and the nearest dozen monsters a clean, fiery end. In the aftermath, the chamber was silent save for the wet shuffling and humming. The Pontiff of Rebirth Garl, now a colossal, monstrous, slug-like being, was carried into the chamber on a throne of corpses. He moved towards the last survivor. Astropath Prime Kahless sat on his dais, untouched by the fighting trembling. You are monsters," Kahless whispered. The Pontiff's chorus voice was gentle, almost soothing. "We are the choir, little bird. We are the new song. And you sang so beautifully for us. The grandfather heard your call. He's so pleased." Kahless looked up, his face a mask of terror. But the terror began to fade. A warmth was spreading through him, a warmth he had not felt since the sickness began. The air, so thick with the stench of death and spores, suddenly smelled sweet. His chronic pain, the migraines of his astropathic duties vanished. He felt a small, pleasant pressure building behind his left eye. A tickle, a wriggle, a slow smile, one of profound, ecstatic peace spread across his face. "He's here," Kahless breathed. He let out a final happy sigh as a tiny, single-horned, giggling creature, a nurgling, burst playfully from his eye socket covered in slime. It chortled, waved its little hands, and then scurried down Kahless's robe to nestle in the Pontiff's welcoming, diseased flesh. The last hope of Thion Primus had died not with a scream, but with a smile. The final unifying wave of pestilence, the grandfather's true embrace, now washed over Thion Primus. It was no longer a creeping sickness, confined to the slums, or a decadent secret in the spires. It was the air itself. It was in the green-tinted rain. It was in the soil. The billions of agricultural serfs who had huddled in their hab blocks, listening to the world dissolve, finally received their gift. The lingering, dull-witted imperial piety that had kept them at their posts dissolved in a wave of euphoric warmth. Across the continents, the bells, which had rung for centuries, with the cold precision of imperial law, fell silent one by one, their mechanisms choked with fungal growths and rust. In their place, a great collective sigh was heard, a sigh of billions. In the sodden, rotting fields in the lower corridors of the spires, in the administratum scriptoriums, the teeming masses of Thion Primus lay down. They did not die in agony. They died in bliss, their faces peaceful, their minds lost in the shared dream of the grandfather's garden. For a single long moment, the planet died. The only sound was the incessant buzzing of flies, the gentle patter of the mucus rain, and the slow, bubbling gulp of the liquefying oceans. The great harvest was over, then the silence was broken. It was broken by a single wet groan. In a field of liquefied wheat, a hand, pale and doughy, pushed its way up through the brown septic sludge. A moment later, another. Then 1,000. Then 1,000,000. Then 1,000,000,000. Across the entire face of Thyon Primus, the dead did not stay dead. The population was rising, resurrected by the joyous necrotic power of the warp. They were no longer human. They were poxwalkers. Their flesh was torn, but not by wounds. It was ripped open from within by the force of their new resilient life. Bones had snapped and reset at impossible lumbering angles. Horns like rotten branches sprouted from their heads and shoulders. Their guts, no longer needed for digestion, had split open their swollen bellies, now just hanging bags of bile spores and tiny giggling nurglings that wrestled in their exposed intestines. Their skin was a canvas of weeping, colorful sores, and their faces were frozen in masks of serene, idiotic joy. They were no longer men, women, or children. They were a single shuffling, moaning mass. The great work of Thyon Primus was not to feed the Imperium with grain, but to birth this new numberless army. Only one bastion of order remained the central fortress of the Thyon Planetary Defense Force. Its walls were gray, pragmatic plasteel, its turrets bristled with heavy bolters and lascannons, and its barracks held 50,000 soldiers, the last men and women loyal to the Golden Throne. They watched their auspex screens as the red dots which had represented the entire planetary population went dark, and then lit up again as one. They watched the gates as the horizon from east to west became a shuffling, lurching sea of pale, corrupted flesh. "Hold the line!" roared Colonel Grash, his voice hard with terror and duty. "For the Emperor fire at will. Purge this filth." The heavy bolters opened up their shells, detonating with satisfying, meaty crunches. Lascannons sliced through the front ranks, carving lines of fire. Hundreds of poxwalkers were blown apart. They were torn to pieces, liquefied, and incinerated. The soldiers on the wall let out a grim cheer, but the cheer died in their throats. Each poxwalker upon its destruction did not simply fall. It detonated. It burst in a spectacular, beautiful, lethal cloud of greenish-black spores, corrosive bile, and infectious vapor. This cloud, the monster's final gift, washed over the PDF fortifications. The men on the walls meters away from the first impacts were drenched in the septic rain. They inhaled the spores. The man firing the heavy bolter, his face spattered with gore, suddenly stopped firing. He coughed a thick, wet sound. He looked at the gun in his hands, then at the approaching horde. He felt a sudden, profound warmth. The terror in his gut vanished, replaced by an ecstatic relief. He began to giggle. "It's a blessing," he whispered, before turning the heavy bolter on his own. Colonel, his face splitting into a wide, joyous grin. It was a catastrophic, perfect trap. To fight the enemy was to be infected by it. To kill was to join them. The PDF's disciplined volleys became their own damnation. The front lines, suffocating on the clouds of spores, collapsed their flak armor, no defense against an enemy that attacked from within. Soldiers stopped fighting and began to embrace laughing as their skin blistered and their bodies began to swell. Armored chimeras, their vents sucking in the corrupted air, became sealed tombs for their crews, who joyously reenacted the pontiff's rituals inside. The fortress gates, the last symbol of imperial authority, were not broken down from without. They were thrown open from within by PDF soldiers eager to welcome their new smiling brothers. The entire planetary defense force dissolved in less than an hour, its 50,000 soldiers, its tanks, and its guns, swelling the ranks of the shuffling ecstatic choir. The last light of resistance on Thyone Primus was snuffed out not with a bang, but with a wet, happy gurgle, at the very heart of the corruption, where the harbinger of bounty had first leaked its sacred gift. Block 94 Delta had ceased to be a physical place. The rust-streaked container walls, the plasteel gantries, the filth-strewn corridors, all had dissolved. They had been replaced by a pulsing organic landscape of living flesh fungus throbbing in time with a slow, unheard heartbeat. The air was so thick with spores that it was a visible swirling green soup. At the center of the main plaza, where the Pontiff of Rebirth had first preached reality itself, had become thin like old damp parchment. It sagged, it wept, it began to tear. The tear was not a violent rift of fire and brimstone. It was a lesion. The air puckered, folded in on itself, and then split open like a ripe, weeping sore. It did not bleed fire. It gushed a torrent of the familiar honey-colored fluid, which steamed and pooled, forming a new holy lake. From this viscous, bubbling portal, a procession emerged, accompanied by the sound of 1 billion buzzing flies and the merry discordant chiming of countless small, rusty bells. First came the Nurglings, tumbling out in a joyous, chortling wave, their small, pot-bellied green bodies glistening. They wrestled, giggled, and splashed in the new pool of filth. They were the heralds, the choir boys of this new septic church. Behind them, carried aloft on a grand, rotting palanquin, which seemed to be a single enormous diseased organ, borne by dozens of straining, groaning Nurglings, came the guest of honor. He was a demon, but he was not a warrior. He was a scholar, a bureaucrat. His form was that of a colossally bloated monkish figure, his green skin stretched taut over a frame, swollen with gas and joyous decay. He wore the tattered robes of a scribe, and from his belt hung not weapons, but counting beads, abacuses made of vertebrae, and measuring instruments crafted from diseased bone. This was Epidemius, the tallyman of Nurgle, the great cataloger of plagues, the chosen recorder of the grandfather's innumerable gifts. In one hand, he held his great uncoiling scroll, a parchment of tanned human skin that dragged for yards behind him, already covered in cramped, spidery script. In the other, he held a squealing Nurgling, which he periodically dipped into a weeping sore on his own arm, as if it were an ink pot, using its tiny, filth-encrusted claw as a quill. Epidemius took a deep, appreciative sniff of the Thyan air, his wide, frog-like mouth splitting into a grin of professional satisfaction. He looked around his single milky eye, swiveling to take in the shuffling hordes of poxwalkers, the weeping architecture, the spore-choked sky. He ignored the Pontiff of Rebirth, who was bowing and scraping in supplication. Epidemius was not here for prayer. He was here for work. Exquisite, his voice boomed a sound like a wet cough from the bottom of a well, a truly inspired vector. Note he dictated, and the Nurgling quill began to scratch frantically on the parchment. Pathogen type, honey sickness. Symptomology, euphoric state, rapid cellular deliquescence, spontaneous mutation. Oh, and the numerical fixation. Class 7, how perfectly orthodox. His palanquin lurched forward, beginning a slow, stately procession through the ruins of the slum. Epidemius and his Nurgling attendants began the great tally. He was meticulous. He stopped to admire a particularly well-formed poxwalker, noting the vibrant ochre of its pus. He gestured to a weeping fungal growth, had a Nurgling measure its girth, and clapped his hands in delight. Note, Garl's Blessing, a fine, robust strain, highly contagious, aesthetically pleasing pustulation. 7 out of 7, his very presence was a catalyst. As he passed, the world bloomed for him. The decay accelerated, becoming a riotous, joyful expression of Nurgle's creative power. Fungi burst into full, complex life at his feet. The poxwalkers, energized by his proximity, began to swell with new and interesting boils, their happy moans taking on a more complex, harmonic quality. The green rain fell thicker, the mucus more viscous. Epidemius was the auditor of oblivion, and he was finding the books of Thione Primus to be in perfect, beautiful order. He was here to count every blessing, every sore, every death, and every joyous rebirth, ensuring that this magnificent new garden would be properly recorded in the Grandfather's eternal ledger. As Epidemius happily conducted his planet-wide audit, a new and final transformation began. The sickly, jaundiced green sky, already choked with spores, and weeping rain began to tear. This was not the subtle, lesion-like portal that had birthed the Tallyman. This was a cosmic violation. High above the planet's atmosphere, the fabric of reality groaned, buckled, and then was ripped open like a colossal sheet of wet canvas. An ocean of roiling, immaterial filth, the very essence of the warp, colored in the Grandfather's livery of green and ochre, poured into real space. The wound in the sky was not a single point, but a yawning, suppurating void that stretched from pole to pole. From this Empyrean wound, the ships emerged. They did not glide with the clean, arrogant grace of an Imperial fleet. They drifted, lumbering, long and heavy like waterlogged corpses rising to the surface of a pond. This was the Plague Fleet, the armada of the Death Guard. They were vessels of impossible size, their ancient, potent designs corrupted by 10,000 years of loving decay. Their hulls were not gray steel, but a pitted, weeping mass of corroded iron, diseased bronze, and throbbing, fleshy, organic growths. Vast, streaming banners of rotting tapestry hung from their prows, depicting the triple skull sigil of their legion. Gardens of fleshy fungi sprouted from their weapon batteries, and clouds of corpse flies, each the size of a man, formed a living, buzzing shroud around each vessel. Leading them was a ship of such malevolent presence that it seemed to drink the light from the system's twin suns. It was a Gloriana-class battleship, a relic from the Great Crusade, now a moving continent of pestilence and spite. Its name was whispered in terror across 1,000 worlds, the Terminus Est. It was a vessel of legend, the flagship of Mortarian's first captain, and its arrival in a system meant only one thing: the end of all hope and the beginning of a new terrible life. The fleet anchored itself in high orbit, a semicircle of obscene, bloated titans hanging in the poisoned sky, eclipsing the weak suns. And then the sound began. It was not the roar of engines or the call to arms. It was the tolling of bells. 7 great bells mounted on the Terminus Est, their chimes impossibly deep and resonant. The sound, amplified by demonic science, struck the planet like a physical blow. It was a note of pure entropy. On the surface, the remaining uncorrupted plasteel and stone of the spires began to vibrate, weaken, and dissolve. The poxwalker hordes, upon hearing it, groaned as one and fell to their knees in rapture. Fresh waves of mutation washing visibly over their bodies. For the few tiny pockets of uninfected survivors huddled in sealed panic rooms, the sound was a torture. It induced a profound, crippling nausea, a sympathetic vibration in the gut that made them double over retching bile their spirits, breaking under the sheer acoustic weight of despair. Then came the voice. It crackled to life over every Vox frequency, every picked screen, every civilian receiver still functioning on the planet. It was not a shout. It was a calm, resonant, scraping sound, like a boulder being dragged over gravel, yet it carried an authority that dwarfed that of any Imperial governor. It was the voice of a Lord of Contagion, speaking from the heart of the flagship, but his words were the creed of his Primarch. People of Thyon Primus, the voice rasped each word thick with phlegm and ancient power. You have toiled. You have ached. You have prayed to a silent golden corpse who gave you only labor and demanded only your death. The picked thieves that could still receive a signal showed only a static wreathed image, a colossal figure in Terminator armor so corrupted and swollen with the grandfather's blessings that he seemed more demon than Astartes. His helm was a skull-like gas mask, and a great smoking censer swung from his hand. You have been lied to, the voice continued, calm, patient, almost gentle. You have been taught to fear the inevitable. You fear pain. You fear change. You fear the end. But there is no end. There is only the cycle. There is only the generosity of the grandfather. The poxwalkers, the cultists, the newly infected nobility all turned their faces to the sky, their minds soaking in the words they already knew to be true. We have watched you. We have guided your release. The pain you felt, it is gone. The hunger that gnawed at you, it is sated. The fear of death that ruled your tiny lives, it is a forgotten joke. The Lord of Contagion raised his free hand, a massive rusted gauntlet. We are the Death Guard. We are Mortarian's sons. We have brought you not death, but endurance. We have brought you the gift of joyful acceptance. You are no longer slaves of a dying empire. You are the blooming flowers in a new eternal garden. Your suffering is over. Your true life, your rebirth, has begun. Accept the final blessing. Welcome your father home. The Lord of Contagion's words ceased, leaving behind a silence thick with menace and the unending tolling dirge of the Terminus Est's 7 bells. In the void, the last vestiges of Imperial authority, the great orbital defense platforms of the Aegis Line were not yet dead. They were steel islands of defiance crewed by grim-faced officers of the Imperial Navy. Men and women who had watched their world die on their view screens. They were beyond terror, steeped in the cold final duty of the Forsaken. All batteries. Commodore Vaughn, the station commander of Aegis Primus, said, his voice flat and dead. He stared at the bloated, obscene mass of the plague fleet. Fire at will. Fire until the reactors bleed. The void lit up. Spears of pure incandescent light, lance batteries lanced out from the stations, striking the enemy ships. Macro cannon shells, each the size of a hab block, followed in a wave of kinetic fury. It was a valiant, hopeless gesture. The lances struck the hulls of the Death Guard ships and sizzled. The light was smothered, absorbed by the layers of diseased flesh and corroded metal as if striking a mountain of wet filth. The macro shells hit with thunderous wet thuds, punching deep craters into the ship's flanks. But there were no secondary explosions, no gouting flames. The wounds just wept, gushing clouds of septic vapor before sealing themselves with new, disgustingly rapid growths of fungal plating. The plague fleet did not even shudder. Then they responded. It was not a return volley of lances or shells. From the pockmarked weeping pores that served as launch bays on the Terminus Est and its escorts, the true blessing was given. Great torpedoes, each one a rusted pockmarked cylinder, were expelled. They were not fired with explosive speed. They were pushed out, drifting with a slow, deliberate, unstoppable momentum, like coffins set afloat on a septic sea. They left trails of greenish-black gas, a miasma of pure corruption. On the bridge of Aegis Primus, the tactical officer watched his console in disbelief. Commodore, void shields are holding, but the torpedoes, they have no explosive warheads. Augers detect biologicals. Massive, unidentifiable biological payloads. "They're not trying to destroy us, sir. Brace Vaughn roared as the first torpedoes made contact. They did not explode. They hit the void shields with a wet, heavy splat. The energy barrier designed to stop plasma and kinetics flickered as the payload, a living, corrosive virus, began to eat the energy itself. The shield overloaded, not with a bang, but with a gurgle, and the torpedoes hit the hull. They were designed to breach, and they did, crunching through the adamantium as if it were rotten wood, and they released their gifts. Inside the station, alarms did not just blare, they died. The clean, recycled air of the bridge was instantly replaced by a thick, sweet, suffocating fog. Vaughn watched, his eyes wide in horror, as the bulkhead in front of him began to change. The clean gray metal did not melt. It rotted. A vibrant, wet, ochre-colored rust spread faster than fire, eating the integrity from the metal. The steel became soft, spongy, and dripped with a corrosive slime. The perfect, rigid lines of Imperial architecture began to sag, bloat, and weep, as if the station itself were becoming diseased flesh. Seals. Check. The tactical officer began before he choked, a bubbling laugh catching in his throat. He looked down. A small, velvety green-black mold was growing on his console. It was spreading visibly, its tiny questing tendrils probing the data ports. The cogitator screens, one by one, flickered their tactical displays, dissolving into swirling, beautiful fractal patterns of decay. The machine spirit of the station, its millennia-old logic core, sputtered, hiccuped, and then began to output a single repeated code. 777. The true horror came from the gun decks. The servitors, the mindless cyborg slaves hardwired into the station's weapon systems, fell silent. Their limbs, which were lathes, claws, and ammunition loaders, ceased their rhythmic work. Then, as one, they turned their blank human heads. Their Vox grills, which were meant to chant litanies of accuracy, crackled to life. A new song began. It was a low, bubbling, multi-part harmony. They were singing. They were singing praises to the grandfather of seven, welcoming the generous gift that was dissolving their own flesh and freeing them from their metallic prisons. The station's machine spirits, corrupted by the virus, joined the chorus, their speakers broadcasting the joyous, gurgling hymn across every deck. Commodore Vaughn raised his last pistol. He did not fire at the enemy, or even at his laughing, swelling crew. He pressed the muzzle to his own temple. His last act, one of defiance against a fate worse than oblivion. The Emperor protects, he whispered, but the last word was lost in a wet cough as his finger pulled the trigger. Across the dark void of Thione's orbit, one by one, the lights of the Aegis line went out, their proud Imperial guns falling silent. They were no longer fortresses of war. They were simply the newest, highest-hanging gardens in Nurgle's ever-expanding paradise. The green sky, torn open by the arrival of the Plague Fleet, wept anew. This was not the gentle, nourishing rain of mucus or the corrosive assault of the virus torpedoes. It was a rain of iron. From the hanging, bloated bellies of the great ships in orbit, thousands of objects detached and began their descent. They were not the sleek, screaming drop pods of the Legionis Astartes of old. They were pitted, scab-like dreadclaw assault boats and massive, wallowing, rusted landers that tumbled through the thick, spore-choked atmosphere with a dead-heavy trajectory. They did not streak with flame. They merely smoked their hulls already coated in the filth of the world they had come to claim. They struck the surface not with a warrior's impact, but with a series of profound, wet, crushing thuds, as if colossal stones had been dropped into a planetary bog. They smashed through the dissolving remnants of the spires, buried themselves deep in the liquefied sludge of the grain fields, and cracked open the corrupted walls of the PDF fortress. For a moment, there was a new silence, a pause in the planet's collective ecstatic groan. Then the assault ramps of the landers did not hiss open. They squelched, releasing a pressurized cloud of iridescent green vapor and a fresh, deafening swarm of black, corpse-bodied flies. From this fog they emerged, the sons of Mortarion, the Death Guard. They were giants, clad in ancient corrupted suits of power armor. The proud white and green of their legion was a forgotten memory, buried beneath 10,000 years of rust verdigris, bubbling organic growths, and filth. Their armor was no longer mere ceramite. It was a union of diseased iron and swollen, weeping flesh, tattered, filthy tabards stiff with dried gore, and ancient septic fluids hung from their waists. They moved with a slow, ponderous, utterly relentless gait. Each step was a heavy final judgment, the ground squelching beneath their corroded boots. They were silent. There were no war cries, no triumphant boasts. There was only the rhythmic wet hiss of their rebreathers, the clank of their diseased war gear, and the incessant, omnipresent buzz of the fly swarms that formed their living halos. Leading these 7 great Vectorums were the Chosen, the elite of Nurgle's mortal warriors. Hulking Blightlord Terminators, encased in monstrously swollen cataphractii plate, advanced like moving bastions of decay. Their great man-reapers and plague spewers held at the ready their forms, so bloated with the grandfather's gifts, they seemed more demon than human. And at their head marched the Lords of Contagion, their very presence a physical weight of despair and entropy. They were colossi of corroded iron, their backs hunched beneath the weight of great smoking censers that belched clouds of diseased fog, their hands gripping massive two-handed plague scythes that dripped with the concentrated essence of the grandfather's blessings. They did not engage in wild, indiscriminate slaughter. This was not a massacre. It was a cull. It was a harvest. The poxwalker hordes which covered the land in a shuffling, moaning sea of pale flesh parted before them. The dead things groaned in ecstatic welcome, shuffling aside to make way for their angels, their saviors. The Plague Marines ignored them, stepping over and through their ranks with grim indifference. They were not here for the converted. They were here for the defiant. Their target was the last tiny spark of Imperial faith. In the ruins of the Governor's Spire, a small missionary contingent of the Adepta Sororitas, trapped on-world during the fall, had barricaded themselves inside the Governor's private chapel. The bronze doors were sealed, and from within, a thin, defiant sound could be heard the singing of battle hymns to the God Emperor. A single Death Guard Plague Marine, his armor host, to a garden of weeping fungi stepped forward. He carried a heavy plague spewer. He did not plant a melta charge or call for a breacher. He simply opened the valve. A torrent of impossibly corrosive living bile, a demon's vomit, sprayed the great bronze doors. The hymns from within faltered as the metal hissed, smoked, and dissolved, sagging into a bubbling heap of molten slag. For the Emperor, a woman's voice, clear and pure, cried from within. A volley of bolter fire erupted from the darkness. The Blightlord Terminators at the front of the squad did not even flinch. The shells thudded into their swollen, blessed flesh, and plate absorbed as if by a wet sponge. The Terminators returned fire, their combi bolters thudding, their blight launchers arcing high. It was not a battle. It was an extermination. The holy silver of the chapel was spattered with filth and gore, the last hymns of faith dissolving into wet gurgles as the Sisters of Battle were given their final unwanted blessing. This task, and others like it across the planet, was completed with brutal, silent efficiency. The last Arbites holdouts were gassed, the last Loyalist Medici sanctums purified. With the final defiant sparks extinguished, the Death Guard turned to their true work. They were shepherds. The Lord of Contagion, his scythe resting on his shoulder, pointed not at an enemy, but at the horizon. Using their great disease demon engines, which now crawled from the landers, they began to organize their new populace. The billions of poxwalkers, this perfect, mindless, joyous army, were gently, methodically herded like a great rotting flock towards the new city centers, the great fungal groves, and the bubbling spawning pools. They were the new citizenry of Thion Primus, and their masters had at last arrived to impose their new, beautiful septic order. Ilara no longer felt the cold. She no longer felt the gnawing, scraping hunger in her belly that had been her constant companion for her entire miserable life. She no longer felt the raw ache in her back from endless labor, or the sharp, splintering fear that came when she heard the Arbite's boots on the gantry. All of it was gone, washed away in a single profound, warm, and generous tide. She felt full, satiated. She looked at her world, the world she had once cursed, and she saw it was beautiful. The rusted, dripping metal of Hab Block 94 Delta was now a soft, velvety landscape of pale green moss and vibrant, purple-capped fungi. The air was not foul. It was a rich, warm perfume, a sweet, loamy aroma of damp earth and blossoming decay. It was a comforting blanket. She held up her hand. It was no longer a thin, calloused, scarred thing. It was a pale, swollen paddle, her fingers lovingly fused by the grandfather's gift. It was strong. A happy, wet giggle sounded from her shoulder. She turned her single milky eye full of love. Little Milo, her son, her dying, coughing child. He wasn't coughing anymore. He wasn't weak. He was a bright, energetic, pot-bellied little creature, his green skin glistening, his single, curious eye looking up at her with pure adoration. He chortled and nuzzled against the weeping golden sore on her neck, a mother's kiss of the purest affection. She was a good mother. At last, she had finally given her son peace. Then she saw them. The angels. They had come from the green, loving sky, just as the pontiff of rebirth had promised. They were colossal, their armor, the color of the new earth, of the blessed rust of the loving moss. They walked among the shuffling, moaning flock, their movements slow, ponderous, and protective. They were the strong sons of the grandfather, the shepherds come to tend his new garden. She felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude. They were not monsters. They were saviors. They were the solemn, silent proof that she was at last safe. She and the rest of the shuffling, ecstatic choir were drawn by a new sound. It was not the crack of a laser gun or the shriek of a foreman's whistle. It was a deep, joyous, squelching thrum, a heartbeat that pulsed from the ruins of the spire cities. She followed the others, her nurgling son giggling on her shoulder, joining the great pilgrimage. In the center of what was once the governor's sterile marble plaza, now a churning, ankle-deep bog of warm golden fluid and beautiful iridescent flies, he had arrived. He was the dream made flesh, a joyous, quivering mountain of flesh, so vast he blotted out the ruins of the spire. He laughed a deep, resonant, bubbling belly laugh that shook the very ground, and with every chuckle, new colorful spores burst from his skin. This was the great unclean one, the living avatar of the grandfather's love, his single benign eye overflowing with generosity for all his new children. Around him, the poxwalkers were dancing. They shuffled in a great, slow, ecstatic circle, their arms outstretched, their moans no longer sounds of pain, but a single, harmonious, wet hymn of adoration. Ilara, her heart full to bursting, shuffled forward, her nurgling son squealing with delight. She joined the dance. She was home. She was loved. She was finally and truly happy. Her loving gaze drifted past the great demon to the wreckage of the governor's throne room at the head of the plaza. The great throne of state was still there, and the governor was still on it. He was magnificent. He was no longer the small, rigid, angry man in a pristine uniform. he had blossomed. Varus was a great pale mountain of joyous flesh, his body gratefully fused with the marble of his throne, which had become soft and yielding to accept him. He was a true host, a living garden for the grandfather's blessings. His chest was burst wide open, not a wound, but a gateway, a generous playground of soft, pulsing organs and vibrant, colorful septic growths. And he was smiling. A true, peaceful, bubbling smile, his eyes closed in serene contentment. He had found the peace his son had promised, a trio of nurglings. Milo among them had scurried from their perches and were now playing. They splashed in a warm pool of bile in the governor's open chest, Cavity giggling as they played a merry game of tag around his exposed, gently pulsing heart. The proud, cold, fearful ruler of Thion Primus had at last learned to relax. He had accepted the gift. He was like Alara at peace. All was well. All was perfect. The great, joyous, shuffling dance had reached its crescendo. The collective ecstasy of billions of resurrected souls, the resonant demonic power of the great unclean one, the focused entropic will of the Death Guard, and the meticulous, ordered tallying of Epidemius all combined into a single overwhelming psychic chord. This chord, a note of perfect, joyous decay, thrummed through the planet's core and into the void. It was an invitation. It was a declaration. It was the planet's final blissful sigh of surrender, and the universe in turn surrendered to it. The sky, that sick, weeping, jaundiced green veil that still separated Thion Primus from the Imperium, finally tore. It did not tear like cloth. It shattered like a pane of diseased frosted glass, the cracks spreading from pole to pole. The sound was not a sound, but a feeling, a sensation of profound final release. Through the cracks, the new reality poured in. The familiar, if corrupted, void of real space was gone. The twin suns, one gold and one white symbols of the old cold. Failed order flickered, wavered like reflections in a septic pond, and then were snuffed out, their light consumed by the new encroaching truth. The sky was no longer a sky. It was a roiling, swirling, endless vortex of impossible, beautiful living color. It was the pure, unfiltered stuff of the warp, a sky of vibrant, churning greens, joyous fungal ochres, and deep, restful, putrescent purples. The dream of the garden was no longer a dream. It was the new permanent and only reality. The planet itself, freed from the banal, tedious laws of gravity and orbit, gave a great shuddering lurch. It began to move. It was pulled with a grand, groaning sigh away from its dead suns, away from the path it had traced for millennia. It was drawn upwards, tumbling in a slow, majestic spiral through the shattered remnants of its own sky and into the waiting, loving, open arms of the Empyrean. It was a newborn world being lifted from the cold, sterile cradle of the Materium. It came to rest not in the void, but in a new unspace. It now floated in a sea of pure, churning emotional energy, surrounded by other similar worlds, dark jewels of pestilence and decay. It had been pulled entirely into a new firmament. It was no longer a lost jewel of the Imperium. It was a new septic jewel in the grandfather's crown, a permanent physical fixture in the realm of Nurgle, within sight of the grandfather's own crumbling, joyous manse. But this new state had to be made eternal. The Lords of Contagion, their work of harvest complete, now turned to their final ritual. The 7 greatest champions of the Legion, along with the Great Unclean One and the Pontiff of Rebirth, gathered at the planet's North Pole. As they began to chant their voices, a 7-part dirge of decay, the very ground split open. The planet's molten physical core, its last tie to real space, was exposed not as a core of iron, but as a new, bubbling generative heart. The great unclean one raised his massive rusted blade and plunged it deep into the wound, and from that stroke, something new began to grow. It was not a tree of wood, but a colossal branching monument of Nurgle's will. Its trunk was a gnarled, twisted column of fused, plague-ridden bone, its bark a weeping, fleshy mass, its leaves great tattered sheets of corroded, singing iron. It grew with terrifying speed, its roots plunging deep, deep into the planet's new heart, anchoring it to the very essence of decay. Its branches reached upwards, spreading out into the new warp sky, their tendrils grasping, questing, and finally fusing with the swirling fabric of the Garden of Nurgle itself. It was a new world axis. It was a permanent divine umbilical cord, tying Thyon Primus now and forever to the realm of its new loving god. The translocation was complete. The grand cosmic realignment had settled the new septic heartbeat of the world, pulsing with a steady, joyous rhythm. At the base of the colossal, newly grown plague tree, whose branches now tickled the roiling sky of the Imperium, the procession of Epidemius came to a halt. The great tallyman, his monkish form quivering with professional excitement, watched as his nurgling quill made its final spidery scratch upon the great scroll of human skin. The nurgling squeaked, dipped its claw one last time into its master's weeping sore, and drew a triumphant 7-part line to signify the end of the audit. Epidemius raised the scroll, letting it unspool for yards, its weight supported by a dozen giggling attendants. He reviewed the figures, his single milky eye scanning the columns of immaculate, filthy script. He had counted every new strain of bacteria, every joyous mutation, every weeping boil, every soul given the blessing, every last beautiful symptom. He let out a deep, satisfied, bubbling sigh that shook his palanquin. The final tally was perfect. It was a work of art. 777 million, he boomed, his voice a chorus of pride. 777,000. 777 new blessings. A perfect score. He chortled a sound like gravel in a sewer. An exemplary conversion. The grandfather will be so pleased. His work on this world was at last complete. High above on the bridge of the Terminus Est, the atmosphere was not one of celebration, but of cold, silent, patient satisfaction. The bridge was a cavern of pitted iron and diseased flesh, its viewing ports, like the milky eyes of a corpse, staring out at the new captured jewel in their legion's crown, a planet now floating in the near warp, tethered to its new reality. A lord of contagion, his great scythe resting on his shoulder, stood at attention. A demonic servitor, a fused mass of cogitator and nurgling, presented a data slate, its screen flickering with the final count from Epidemius's tally. The Lord of Contagion did not look at it. His gaze was fixed on the great shadowy alcove at the heart of the bridge. There, barely illuminated by the sickly green light of the displays, a figure sat. He was a giant, a true Primarch, his form so vast and mutated by the grandfather's love that he was almost one with the diseased throne-like mechanism he inhabited. Great tattered insectoid wings, like those of a monstrous fly, drooped from his back, their membranes weeping a clear toxic fluid. His face was hidden behind the snarling, pitted mask of his rebreather, the tubes and pipes that fed him his legion's blessings, pulsating with a slow mechanical rhythm. This was Mortarion, the Pale King, the Reaper. The Lord of Contagion spoke, his voice a rasp. "My lord, the tallyman confirms the count. The harvest is complete. The world is reborn. It is perfect." He waited. The great winged silhouette did not move. The only sound was the incessant hiss of the Primarch's respirator and the distant tolling bells. Then very slowly the massive armored head dipped, a single ponderous nod. It was enough. It was the approval of a god of death. The Lord of Contagion bowed. "We shall rename the world as is custom, a monument to its last most receptive adherent." He turned to a console. "Log the new designation. This planet is no longer Thione Primus. It is now Varus's Bloom." A new pinprick of light had been added to the Death Guard's map of the warp, a new fortress of decay, a new bastion from which to launch the next generous sevenfold crusade. Far away in the cold, logical heart of the Segmentum Solar, in a data vault, the size of a city scribe adept, Tillus 4G, his body more machine than man, reviewed his morning queue. His world was a pillar of flickering green data. His task was to balance the great ledger of the Imperial tithe for the subsector. A red sigil, a mark of non-compliance, had been flashing patiently next to the entry for Thione Primus for 3 standard weeks. No tithe ships had arrived. No astropathic confirmations had been received. The single corrupted message that had arrived, the one of garbled laughter, had long since been purged as data heresy. Tillus 4G queried the long-range auger stations. The response was simple, cold, and final. Where Thione Primus should be, there was nothing. No debris field, no lingering radiation, no star. The entire system had, according to all verifiable Imperial-sanctioned instruments, simply ceased to exist. The scribe adept felt nothing. He felt no horror, no grief for the billions of lives lost. He was not programmed for such inefficiencies. He simply accessed the tithe ledger, his mechadendrite tapping in the authorization codes. He selected the entry, Thione Primus, and marked it with the 2 most final devastating words in the Imperial lexicon Perdita: lost. With a single keystroke, a world was erased. Billions of lives, their history, their toil, their agonizing fall, and their joyous rebirth were reduced to a footnote in a forgotten file. The red light stopped flashing. Tillus 4G moved to the next item in his queue. It was a request for increased rations for the hive world of Gathalamor. A new alert was already forming in a different ledger, noting that Gathalamor and the 2 other hive worlds that had depended on Thione's grain were now facing catastrophic system-wide famine. Billions more would starve, reduced to cannibalism in the dark underhives. But that Tillus 4G noted was a problem for the Departamento Munitorum, not for him. The great uncaring bureaucratic machine of the Imperium ground on its gaze, already turned away from the shadow where a world had been. The inquisitorial Ordo Hereticus, in a rare act of efficiency, sealed the entire subsector. Thione's name was struck from the star charts, its coordinates declared forbidden. To speak its name was heresy. It had never existed. It was a ghost, an echo of silence in the vast hollow halls of Imperial history. But Thione Primus was not silent. And it was not dead. It was, in fact, more alive than it had ever been. Varus's Bloom, as it was now known, thrived. It was a new, vibrant, permanent fixture in the Garden of Nurgle, a testament to the grandfather's boundless generosity. It was a paradise of a sort. Here there was no pain, there was no hunger, there was no fear. There was no ambition, no despair, no hope. There was only the cycle. The joyous, endless, beautiful cycle of life, death and rebirth, all happening at once. Great fleshy trees wept rivers of golden fluid that fed the shuffling, smiling poxwalker choirs. The cities of the nobility, now soft, pulsing fungal mountains, were nurseries for new and imaginative forms of blissful disease. The rusted silent hulks of the Death Guard fleet and the dissolved ruins of the Aegis stations hung in the swirling warp sky like dark, watchful moons, their hulls host to new thriving ecosystems. In his throne room, which was now a warm, damp grotto, the bloated, peaceful form of Governor Varus continued his happy, serene decay, his nurgling children playing forever in the playground of his open chest. This was the final devastating lesson of the grim, dark future. In a galaxy that knew only war, the greatest horror was not destruction. It wasn't the clean, final death of the exterminatus, the fate the astropaths had so desperately prayed for. The greatest horror was corruption. And the final, most exquisite turn of the knife, the true gift of Mortarion, was that the corrupted did not scream. They did not rail against their fate. They accepted it. They welcomed it with open, weeping arms and a joyous, bubbling laugh. The grandfather's ultimate victory was not in taking a life, but in taking the meaning of life and replacing it with a serene, idiotic, and eternal bliss. The gift was not death. It was the complete, utter, and final removal of hope and its replacement with the profound, unshakable, and everlasting comfort of absolute despair.